All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the CJS Noon Lecture. My name is Kiyotaro Tsutsui. I'm a faculty member in the sociology department here. I need to make a couple of announcements before I introduce Professor Shigematsu. One, this event is co-sponsored by University of Michigan's Institute for Research on Women and Gender and the Center for Japanese Studies. So we thank the Institute for Research on Women and Gender for co-sponsoring this event. The second announcement is an upcoming event, a sayonara, a farewell performance by our guest Benshi Kataoka Ichiro, which takes place on February 23rd at 7 p.m. in Natural Sciences Auditorium. If you're interested in this, there are flyers close to the door, table near the door, so please feel free to pick it up. All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Setsu Shigematsu. She is a multi-talented intellectual force to be reckoned with. She has written widely on and studied widely on issues around American imperialism, Japanese imperialism, transnational liberation movements, comparative feminist and critical theory, and media and cultural studies. She has actually directed, or she was the director, writer, and co-producer of a feature-length documentary about the prison industrial complex and the prison abolition movement called Visions of Abolition. You can go to www.visionsofabolition.org to purchase that film, and I highly recommend it. And she has co-edited a book, Militarized Currents Towards a Decolonized Future in Asia and the Pacific, which examines the militarization of Asia and the Pacific as an extension of US and Japanese colonialism in the region. And today she is here, and she's currently an assistant professor at the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at the University of California, Riverside, soon to be associate professor. And today she is going to speak about her book, Scream from the Shadows, the Women's Liberation Movement in Japan. This is the first serious scholarly analysis of the Japanese women's liberation movement, or Woman's Lib in Japanese. And this work, I'm not going to give it away, but it enhances our understanding of Japan's gender-based modernity and imperialism, and our perspective on transnational liberation and feminist movements worldwide. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Shigematsu.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy days and walking from your various destinations to join me this afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here, and I want to begin by thanking Professor Kiyotaro Tsutsui for his invitation, as well as the Center for Japanese Studies. I would also like to thank Professor Nadine Neber and the Institute for Women and Gender for their generous invitation to have me. I also want to express my appreciation to the staff of the center, Roberta, Peggy, and Jane Ozanich, who made my trip here so smooth and pleasant. So this afternoon, my talk draws from my book, Scream from the Shadows, the Women's Liberation Movement in Japan, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press last spring in 2012. So this is the first book-length study of the movement, and so I took a transdisciplinary approach to study its history, politics, philosophy, and internal dynamics, as well as its legacy. While much of my research is based on a close reading of the movement's multitude of publications, literature, manifestos, and its alternative media known as minikomi, I also looked at the media coverage. And I spent over 2 years in the quote-unquote field, interviewing, conversing, and interacting with many of its key activists from 1999 to 2001. I then would return on a periodic basis to meet with them, and I maintained correspondence with many of its key activists for a 10-year period. So to begin with its legacy, this movement is widely recognized as the beginning of a new wave of feminist activism in the post-war period, marking a watershed in Japanese feminist history. In fact, Japanese feminist scholars themselves refer to this as the beginning of second wave feminism in Japan, following arguably somewhat problematically the master narratives of the wave theory of feminism as it has been predominantly rendered through the establishment of women's studies and academic feminism. But rather than place this movement in a kind of one-to-one correspondence with Euro-American second wave feminism, in my book I attempt to contextualize the movement to account for its multiple domestic and international political genealogies and its contested origins. So for those of you who are in Japan studies or who are students of Japanese literature, you might have interpreted the reference to the shadows and thought of the famous text by Tanizaki Junichiro in praise of shadows. But if Tanizaki was in a sense writing about the distinctiveness of a Japanese aesthetic and sensibility against the blinding light of the West, I'm not writing this historiography simply against the West per se, but certainly it arises in the dark shadows of a longer legacy of Orientalist history, with an aim to place this struggle within a global history of feminist and liberation movements. So the first part of my book, called Genealogies and Violations, contextualizes and traces the movement's deep roots in its own distinct domestic political genealogies in terms of an unequivocal rebellion against Japanese patriarchy in both mainstream society and in the Japanese left. My work thus situates the movement within a larger internationalist and transnational constellation of liberation movements that arose during the 1960s and 1970s as challenges to U.S. imperialism and Japanese state authority. While this radical feminist movement was certainly inspired by the rise of the U.S. women's liberation movement, in my presentation I also highlight the important ways in which it was different from dominant Euro-American conceptions of liberal and radical feminism. So in my talk, I begin today with a brief background and overview of the who, what, and whys of the movement. And next I'll touch upon its similarities and then highlight its differences from radical feminisms in the US. Then I move on to a quick assessment of its limits, contradictions, and conclude with a few reflections on the ways its legacy applies to our current political conditions. So this movement was organized under the banner of Woman of Lib, a Japanese transliteration of the phrase Woman Lib, which signaled at once its solidarity with other women's liberation movements, such as the one in the US, and also its difference from existing Japanese women's liberation movements, which had used the name Josei Kaiho Undo until that point, or Fujin Kaiho Undo. Many Woman Lib activists were variously involved in the New Left, anti-Vietnam War, and student movements of the late 1960s, and they learned many difficult, painful, and productive lessons from those experiences. This grassroots movement saw itself as part of a worldwide uprising of political movements against imperialism and capitalism, and in sync with U.S. Women's Lib, and also inspired by the Black Power movement in the United States. Most Lib participants were college-educated young intellectuals, largely women in their 20s and 30s. They had been raised in the post-occupation education system. As women who were predominantly ethnic majority Japanese and largely from the Japanese post-war middle and lower middle classes, they occupied a positionality that was relatively privileged yet discontent. Some were university students who devoted themselves to organize the movement. Others were professionals, writers, journalists, mothers, lesbians, and teenage runaways struggling to find their place in society. In sync with the student rebellions and dissent erupting across cities around the world, the Woman of Lib identified as part of this larger wave of revolt. As a network of urban-based, autonomous women's-only groups, Lib cells did not seek to establish a hierarchical organization, such as, National Organization of Women, or appoint a formal leader or spokesperson, which characterized the new organizing style of the late 1960s movements like Zen Kyoto and Beiheiren. Like many of the movements of its day, it was in principle anti-hierarchical. Its fundamental break from the existing constellation of progressive and leftist movements was based on its emphasis of three symbiotic concepts, namely the liberation of sex, the liberation of onna, and the liberation of eros. So these concepts worked hand in hand. The liberation of onna and the liberation of sex were symbiotic in that the term onna was adopted. It basically is one of the terms for women, but it is a term that was imbued with sexualized connotations. Linguist and feminist scholar Orie Endo states that onna contains a strong and negative sexual connotation that in conversation can also be, substituted for prostitute or mistress. A veteran activist and lesbian Sayama Sachi stated in an interview that precisely because of onna's link and reference to a sexual being with many desires, and because of its negative connotation that it had during the 1960s, Lib deliberately reappropriated this term in a way that was similar to the way that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender movements reappropriated the term queer. Echoing the Black Power movement as well, which declared that Black is beautiful, these activists, specifically Tanaka Mitsu, declared onna is beautiful. In this manner, the Lib movement was not only inspired by the burgeoning feminist movement in the U.S., but also took its inspiration trans-specifically from the Black liberation struggle. So Woman of Lib was a radical feminist movement, meaning that its feminists saw the need for comprehensive political, economic, social, and cultural transformation. Therefore, unlike liberal feminism, its goal was not to gain equality with Japanese men, who they described often as slaves of capitalism. This movement was therefore informed by Marxism and the New Left movements of its day, where it gained its anti-imperialist breadth and grounding. The New Left had emerged during the 1960s as rebel offshoots of the established left, namely the Japanese Communist and Socialist parties and established unions. The New Left was a heterogeneous and explosive constellation of Marxist and revolution-oriented political sects that argued, and some of whom literally fought each other over the correct interpretation of revolution and the tactics to pursue it. As many of you who might be familiar with that history, the New Left is known for the degree and severity of its intersectarian fighting among several of its sects during the 1970s. Many of the Lib activists involved in the existing left movements were fed up not only with the sexism within these movements, but the very way that revolutionary subjects and revolutionary action was being defined by what they described as male thought, otoko no shiso. They declared the need for onna no shiso, namely women's theory and philosophy, bringing a new level of consciousness to the gendered nature of discourse, philosophy, and politics. Certain sects of the New Left and the student movement culture privileged street protest, which entailed fighting with the riot police. As you can see from this slide here, a famous confrontation between the students of Kyoto University and the riot police at the gates in 1969. So Woman of Lib criticized the privileging of how such fighting, the riot police, became an ultimate sign of one's commitment to the revolution or to the cause. One veteran activist, Mori Setsuko, stated that it was actually while she was training to use these sticks or metal pipes or wooden shafts called gebabo, that while she was being trained by these male students, it was during that training where she realized that for her, she couldn't continue to believe that this is what revolutionary practice needed to be. So it was after that training period that she decided to break off and start her own women's-only group at her campus. So these women rejected and criticized the left's masculinist idea of revolution, and they also therefore transformed the very notion of revolution itself. Although Lib activists did confront the state, as we can see here in this photograph of their very first street demonstration, you can actually see a Lib activist also there holding the gebabo, and some of his activists also donning the helmets that was very characteristic of the New Left at the time. They also, they didn't emphasize solely this kind of street confrontation. They also, engaged in sit-ins, which was another somewhat less confrontational, but nonetheless confrontational mode of engaging with the state. Here they are having a sit-in at the Ministry of Health to protest and object to the way that the government was attempting to restrict women's abortion. So in terms of their notion of liberation, I could describe it for you as a kind of tripartite schema, which involved the liberation of the self, the liberation of the self's relation to the other, and to that of society. So the liberation of sex constituted the core logic of the movement, which animated and informed their politics. The liberation of sex was a key concept, but it did not simply imply free sex, which was characteristic also of that era. Rather, it focused on a critique of the modern family system as the foundational unit of Japanese national imperialism that reproduced discrimination. These activists honed in on how the family system symbolized and reproduced discrimination in multiple ways. In the Japanese case, the family system, as many of you know, was ideologically linked to the emperor system, in that the emperor in the wartime period was considered the father of this family nation, whereby women were supposed to offer up, their children to the emperor to serve in the emperor's army. Therefore, this critique of the family extended to a critique of the national imperial ideological structure. Furthermore, the family registration system called the koseki system, which also many of you are probably familiar with, encoded discrimination in multiple ways. It functioned legally and materially to ensure patriarchal privilege, requiring a father's recognition of a child to be deemed legitimate. Lib activists denounced this male-centered family system as the basic mechanism that reproduced and naturalized discrimination in Japanese society. In their critique of the family system, they were able to decipher and grasp the often invisible violence inherent in a system that had been normalized, naturalized, and remained thoroughly regulated by the state. Tanaka Mitsu, arguably the most influential activist and theorist of the movement, and later would become its icon. She wrote one of the most famous manifestos of the movement called The Liberation from the Toilet, or Benjo Kara no Kaiho, which declared that women were used by the male-centered system. They were divided into this binary logic of good women and bad women, meaning wives and mothers who remained faithful to this male-centered family system, and toilets, or benjo, the latter referring to the way that prostitutes or so-called comfort women were used by the system as receptacles for the excess male sexual desire. Insofar as Tanaka related the status of chaste Japanese wives to the abjected condition of the so-called comfort women, she linked virtuous domesticity with imperialist sexual violence. One of the placards at their first demonstration on October 21st, 1970, which I showed you a photo of earlier, declared, "A wife and a prostitute are both raccoons in the same den," indicative of how Woman Lib's notion of the liberation of sex was primarily targeted a fundamental critique of the Japanese marriage family system. Therefore, while its critique of the marriage family system was similar to other forms of feminism insofar as it was a revolt against patriarchy, its specificity as a Japanese feminist movement involved its critique of the way that the family system was so deeply tied into the structure of Japanese national imperialism. Instead of acquiescing to the mainstream, many Woman Lib refused to enter the marriage family registration system, and a number of its activists created communes with other Lib activists and their children to raise them together and support each other. So the Lib movement simultaneously denounced the family system and created alternatives to that system as a means of living revolution in the day-to-day, as a means of creating new types of relationships between women and their children. So here are some images of a few of the communes. So to sum up briefly, Woman Lib was similar to other radical feminist movements insofar as it promoted a woman's rejection of the patriarchal family marriage system, encouraged women's independence, created women's only organizing spaces, and they practiced a women-centered culture. Others, like Machiko Matsui, have described it as a movement that encouraged women's self-expression and self-determination. They organized witch concerts, which featured only women artists and performers, calling them witch concerts, majo konsato, embracing and taking pride of the idea of women as witches. And they supported men's participation in these witch concerts insofar as they trained men who wanted to participate to be the child care workers. So in this manner, they really reversed the roles by placing women only on the stage and putting men in the back as, the babysitters. So some women were already married and remained married, but even to this day, decades later, marriage itself is highly politicized within the Lib culture, and it's, I would say, seen as a kind of political compromise. Lib activists politicize sexuality, heterosexuality, writing about women's menstruation, sex, hostessing, prostitution, sex with women, and lesbian love. They protested for reproductive freedom, and they advocated giving birth outside the family system. So rather than actually stressing a woman's right to abortion, you can see in this next protest banner that they actually had a holistic approach. Rather than calling for a woman's right to abortion, they're calling here for a society where humans can live. We want to live, we want to give birth. So they actually had a very affirmative approach to women's birth-giving power, rather than, emphasizing access to the pill or abortion. They also politicized sexual violence against women, and they also taught women martial arts for self-defense. So I feel that they were always making this double move of critiquing and then creating these alternative practices. They created a space also for the representation and affirmation of lesbian love, although it did not promote lesbian feminism as the ideal alternative to compulsory heterosexuality in the early 1970s. And I'm going to return to this at a later moment in my talk. In some of the enduring legacies of Lib has been to significantly transform the connotation and usage of the term onna and how women's sexuality is expressed in society. So in this next section, I'd like to elaborate a few of the ways that Lib was very different from radical feminism in the US. As I've already touched upon, Lib's notion of the liberation of sex was informed by an anti-imperialist politics, which can be attributed to its intimate ties to the Japanese New Left. The Japanese New Left positioned itself against what it criticized as U.S.-Japanese neo-imperialism or imperialism, this new post-war formation they referred to as Nichibei Teikoku Shugi. While the Lib movement separated itself organizationally from the New Left, its direct lineage from it also expanded its politics into an anti-imperialist feminism. This fostered a pan-Asian feminist consciousness, making Lib activists attuned to how other Asian women from Japan's former colonies, such as Korea, were being recolonized through the emergence of a commercial sex tourism, known as kisaing tourism. So they also protested these kinds of sex tours for Japanese businessmen. This thread within the Lib movement was most prominently pursued through the feminist activism and leadership of Matsui Yayoi and her organization. This anti-imperialist Pan-Asian feminism was one of the distinct characteristics and was one of the sub-threads of the movement that has endured to today. The most salient distinction between Woman of Lib and radical feminism, in my view, revolves around its approach to women and violence. 3 examples of this difference were in its approach to abortion and violent women, such as Kogoroshi Onna and Nagata Hiroko. I write about Nagata Hiroko in my last chapter, and she was one of the leaders of the United Red Army. But I won't go into that subject matter today because it's quite complex. And if some of you want to ask questions about it in the Q&A, I welcome you to. First, Lib took a markedly different approach to abortion overall. Thanks to Tanaka Mitsu and her close relationship with another central Lib activist in the movement named Yones Tomoko, who continues to be very involved in reproductive freedom. Yones Tomoko was disabled, and her theorization of abortion, therefore, was different. Rather than emphasizing a woman's right to abortion, Tanaka stated that she recognized it as a form of murder. And I want to now quote directly from Tanaka Mitsu in translation. To undergo an abortion under objective conditions, that is, when the self subjectively selects an abortion, I would want to make myself conscious of that self that is a murderer. End of quote. In the first chapter of my book, I elaborate how Tanaka links abortion with mothers who kill their children, who are referred to in Japanese as Kogoroshi Onna, in her feminist discourse. Tanaka does not say that it is right to murder children or unborn children. However, she does not also condemn women who abort or women who kill their children. Rather, she de-individualizes the act and redirects it to question the state of a society in which a woman, any woman, could become so alienated to commit such a horrendous act. In making this argument, she also emphasizes that women should recognize their own inherent capacity for violence in their act of aborting their children and place it on a continuum with those who've killed their children after they are born. According to Tanaka, to abort a child is a murderous act, not committed as a free choice, but rather situated in a social system produced through population control and the selective criminalization of gendered bodies. So based on this kind of statement, other scholars have attempted to align Tanaka Mitsu with a pro-life stance, which I disagree with. I disagree because Tanaka was coming from a place that wanted women to confront their capacity for violence, a critique of selective criminalization, and alienation within an advanced capitalist society. She did not advocate that all life was sacred, neither was she an advocate of nonviolence. Even though she was very spiritual and others have compared her to a medium of the spirit of the 1970s, she had a very complex approach to violence as a feminist philosopher. In the early 1970s, the rates of kogoroshi, this kind of child killing, they peaked in 1974, and the Lib activists sought to investigate and reframe this phenomena. They objected to the way that the media was consistently blaming the mothers, and only the mothers, without critiquing the structure of the family system. And what they wanted to do instead was make it a societal or structural problem. Lib groups went so far as to declare solidarity with mothers who killed their children. And in doing so, they aligned themselves with marginalized Japanese women who had committed quote-unquote criminal acts, breaking middle-class barriers to form a cross-class feminist solidarity. Lib women were not trying to idealize violence, as some groups in the left had done, but they wanted to confront it and get at its roots. Tanaka theorized the roots of violence, and in theorizing Kogoroshi Onna and Woman of Lib together, she theorized the presence of violence within women's bodies, not simply as a problem of male violence or as a symptom of patriarchy, as many feminist theories tend to do. For Tanaka, violence was also inherent in the specificity of a woman's body and being, to the particularity of her sex. Tanaka wrote metaphorically of the revival of the womb that gave birth to Kogoroshi Onna, the women who had killed their children, and the Woman of Lib. The revival of the womb refers to the transformation of the womb from a site of negation and a site of control to a site of resistance and revenge. Tanaka writes, and I quote again, "It is precisely the emergence of the child-killing onna that signals the mutation of the womb from being an object to being a womb that thinks for itself, that screams and stamps its revenge in the blood of its own child. Lib and the children who are killed are both two extreme examples of the branches that share the same root." So according to Tanaka Mitsu, women who killed their children and Lib share the same originary process, referring to the historical revolution of the womb's mutation from an object to a subject. Tanaka connects child killing to the liberation of sex, saying that this was part of the revenge of the womb, a sign of the violent revival of the hitherto repressed power of women's sex. Therefore, women were not outside or separate from violence. Rather, violence was to be located within women. For Tanaka, the womb was not only the symbolic and material site of the creation of new life, but also the origin of destruction and violence. The implications of Lib activist approach to violence in Tanaka's theorization constitutes a different feminist and feminine ontology, whereby one of the roots to women's liberation is to confront one's own capacity for violence, which in turn could lead to a transformation of how women deal with the other and those who actually express violence. So this in turn, this inward turn to confront one's own violence was meant to be a way to transform the way that one related to the other and organized society at large. And I interpret this as constituting a proto-feminist abolitionist politics. So in this last section, I'd like to say a few words about the contradictions and limits of the movement. Insofar as they practiced and emphasized self-liberation and self-determination, Women Lib activists did not necessarily prioritize reaching out to non-Japanese women in Japan, namely ethnic minority women. Even though they were theoretically against the state and critical of Japanese nationalism, their self-identity became a kind of default limit in terms of their practice. So although they weren't active in reaching out to ethnic minority groups, many Lib activists sought solidarity with other Asian women, as I've mentioned, guided by their consciousness of themselves as a former colonizing nation and a neo-imperial power in the region. Despite its anti-hierarchical principles, a hierarchy nevertheless emerged. There were power struggles among the women involved in the movement, and in short, Tanaka Mitsu and her version of Lib emerged as hegemonic. Not surprisingly, there were also problems among the women living in the communes, particularly in the collective spaces where Tanaka lived. Moreover, the subsequent establishment of women's studies in Japan, in conjunction with the mass media, have made Tanaka Mitsu the icon of the movement. In doing so, as is the problem with other icons, Tanaka's voice and iconic stature overshadows the more complex, complicated, and multitudinous history of Lib. While the movement cannot and should not be reduced to Tanaka Mitsu, her voice and theorization of Lib, which in my estimation is nonetheless the most powerful, poetic, unique, and compelling among the activist intellectuals of the movement, in a sense often metonymically stands in for the movement. So this is a difficult conundrum to work through as a historian of the movement, well aware of the complicated power dynamics and hurtful experiences of the Lib activists with each other. But ultimately, what is compelling and different about a very, very powerful figure like Tanaka are the ways in which she enables us to rethink the problem of violence within and among women, which in my estimation has been an aporia of feminist thought. Tanaka was explicitly heterosexual in her writings and practice, and she thought to theorize how men and women could have better relations and how women could change from a woman who is embraced to a woman who is embraces. In one of her earlier articles, she talked about the move from dakareru onna to daku onna, so moving from the passive, to the active. However, due to her strong personality and her unwillingness to explore lesbian love herself, there was never a lesbian positive practice emphasized at the outset of the movement. And to the contrary, there were times when homophobia would express itself among activists, even as it did in feminist movements elsewhere. For example, after some lesbians came out in the communes, on occasion, homophobia was expressed by certain activists, despite its onna-centered principles. And this hurt some women to the point that they left the movement and the communes. So in particular, the conditions at the Lib Shinjuku Center, which was the most famous center, organizing center in the movement, which was located in Tokyo. Some of you probably know where Shinjuku is. This was a unique commune in the movement insofar as it was open 24 hours a day as also a shelter for women and an organizing and networking hub. The activists there, however, were under so much pressure on a continual basis, pressure from the state, from fighting court battles, police surveillance, and other leftists as well, that their own relationships with each other could not be prioritized. And as a result, in this pressure cooker situation, their personal relations with each other were damaged, sometimes for decades to come. So this excess or contradiction of struggling for liberation with other women in the process ended up hurting those other women, and this remains certainly one of the contradictions of the movement. So rather than reflect nostalgically about the 1970s or gloss the problems and limits of the movement, I think that it behooves us to learn from those past mistakes, because I would argue that many of those same mistakes continue to plague, fracture, and divide leftist cultures today. That is to say, in many progressive or leftist spaces, people still often have a difficult time dealing with power dynamics constitutive of those spaces and organizations, despite the fact that we are supposedly adept at critical analysis. Finally, to return to the question of the relationship between feminism and violence. As I stated, I believe that the problem of violence in and among women has been an aporia of feminist thought. Many of us who identify as feminists, I imagine, have experienced other feminists who fully believe they are nonviolent, but in fact do engage in forms of violence that are less visible or less obvious than a slap to the face, but potentially more damaging than that. In response to this, I believe that we need to pursue a different feminist analytics of violence. What I've taken from the Live movement is a reconceptualization of how we can understand ourselves in relation to violence as part of violent systems that we are always already implicated and complicit in terms of structural, symbolic kinds of violence that we must try not to conceal, but understand as systems that still need transformation as an ongoing, unfinished project. So in closing, I wish to return for a final moment to the title, Scream from the Shadows. These activists came out of the shadows, decrying the violence of motherhood within the confines of the Japanese family system, with its roots in Japanese national imperialism. They came out of the shadows of the Japanese left and new left with a scream, a piercing scream that brought attention to many forms of political violence that were hitherto muted. These women activists experienced repression from the state and from other leftists, and their screams were responses not only to the immediacy of the violence they saw around them, but an expression of what Tanaka described as a historicity of oppression that took the form of a grudge carried in the wombs of women, which, in sync with the worldwide revolt, exploded and ignited a new movement with reverberations that echo until today. Thank you for listening.